Today, I will be discussing my strategies used to select the mutual funds that I like the most, as well as the least, out of the domestic, international, and consumer discretionary sector. Out of these mutual funds, I analyzed about 30 mutual funds in each category. While analyzing those mutual funds, I used Fidelity Investments to research the mutual funds. Um, I researched Fidelity New Millennial Fund, Leverage Company Stock Fund, Dividend Growth Fund, Blue Chip Value Fund, and OTC Portfolio Fund. Those were the five that I narrowed it down to. I looked over 10 in each sector, broke it down to the top five that I wanted to analyze, and from there, I broke it down to the most and the least that I preferred. So let's start with the most that I preferred as far as the mutual funds. The one that I would invest in if, I was looking for mutual funds in the domestic sector, it would be the Fidelity New Millennium Fund. The reason being, as I was looking over the different funds, I paid close attention to the average annual returns, the expense ratio, their turnover rate or ratio, the length of time that the manager was over the fund, as well as the return of the fund rating, as well as the risk. And I also took a close look at the dividends as well. So, New Millennium Fund, I like that the expense ratio was 0.54%. The turnover rate was at 31%, which means that they didn't, turn over as many assets. They didn't owe, a lot of equity. Also, the average annual return for the New Millennial Fund was at a constant growth rate. It wasn't so much as just big jumps, but it gradually grew. The managers on this particular mutual fund have been there since 2006, and the firm was rated from Morningstar as having average returns with a little bit above average risk. And also the dividends for this particular fund, it was gradually increasing. Next, what I liked least in the domestic sector that I looked at was the leverage company stock fund. With this one, the annual returns were declining, a high expense ratio of 80%. The turnover ratio was at 64%, which is, you know, rather high. Management, on the other hand, had been there for a while, since September of 2016. So that was, that was a good sign, but also not so great, being that the numbers were what they were, to say that the manager had been there for 2 years already. Also, another thing that I did not like about this fund was that the return was below average and the risk was high. So, of course, if you plan on making high risk, you obviously want, a higher return. That's typically, how it goes, being of the risk return rules. Next, we're going to move on to the international. For the international mutual funds, Again, for each different sector, I looked at typically the same ratios, the same things. I looked at the expense ratios, turnover rate, the performance, the risk, the returns, the dividends. That was my guideline on my decision, making my thought process. That's what I went with. So as far as annual returns here, um, they were okay. I mean, 1 year was 6.18%, 3 years is 7.28, 5 year 5.66, and for the life of the company 7.16. So even though it kind of dropped a bit, it still came back up, and the life that performance of the annual returns is estimated to be, you know, fairly great compared to years one and five. The expense ratio, however, for this particular fund was extremely high. It was at a 1.35, and also the turnover ratio was at a 61%. Fund managers, they have both. Well, two of the fund managers, actually three, have been there since 2004. Again, that kind of didn't have that much weight to it, being that the numbers were a bit iffy. Um, However, the return for this particular fund was above average, and the risk was below average. So that's kind of, what you would want. If you're taking minimal risk above below average risk and you're still getting an above average return, that's a fund that I would definitely be interested in. As well as those dividends increased 2012 and 13. They were at point 2012 at 0.065, 2013 0.085, 0.085 again for year 2015. 17 was 0.091, and 20 that was 16. 2017 was 0.114. So that would definitely be an international fund that I would be interested in leaning towards. Now, for the worst funds that I reviewed in the international sector, it was Fidelity Worldwide. Fidelity Worldwide, their average annual returns, it was fairly okay. Um, it did tend to drop heavily between years 1 and 3, which was a concern of mine. It went from 19.94% and it dropped down to 9.72%. So that was an excessive drop. But it did come back up, estimated for year 5 to 11.36. But again, in 10 years, it drops again until 7.21. So those returns were, a bit sticky. They weren't consistent at all. So that rose for questions dealing with this particular fund. And also the turnover rate was at 122%, which means they, of course, didn't own majority of their assets. They were turning everything over basically at 122%. The length of time that the manager was there was a good length. They've been there since December of 2006. So they had some longevity there at that firm. But it just seems as if they haven't gotten a good grasp, on the assets, being how high the turnover rate is. The return for this firm, however, was above average, and the risk also was above average. So it kind of balanced itself out. As far as the risk and return, what you were investing, you typically got back. So I mean, if you break even, although it's not, profitable, but it's not a loss. So that was one thing that I did appreciate about that worldwide Fidelity Worldwide Fund. And now I'm going to move on to the consumer discretionary section. This section kind of deals with retailing. I have one firm that is a retailing portfolio, automotive, multimedia, as well as a leisure. Oh, I'm sorry. And another is just a consumer discretionary portfolio. So out of these, initially I assumed, just going, as a guess, that the leisure fund would be the most interesting fund, but I was incorrect. The most promising was the retailing portfolio, which that was the second that I considered maybe being the top. But the retailing was the most interesting and profitable uh, portfolio or mutual fund that I looked at. Now, with these mutual funds, the average returns were great. They were not at a excessive growth rate, but they were very constant. Year one, 34.88%. Year three, 19.45%. Year five was at 19.97. And then 10 years was 19.84. So, like I said, it wasn't a constant or a big growth, but we had that drop between year one and year three. But after year three, everything just stayed the same on average. The expense ratio here was a 0.78, which typically I was looking for expense ratios that were 0.75 and below. So 0.78, it's just kind of on the fence a bit, but it is under the 0.80, which was my main marker as if, hey, this is something that I need to pay attention to. However, the turnover rate was really good for this mutual fund. It was only at 24%. So that stated, that the company is, fairly in control of their assets. The fund manager is one of the fund managers, however, has been employed with the mutual fund or running the mutual fund since 2016. Another has just started, as far as May 2018. So with the two of them together, it may be a good turnout for this particular mutual fund. Now, one of my favorite things about this fund, which is the retailing portfolio fund, is that the return of this firm was rated as a high return firm, and the risk was average. Just made the average marker. So, of course, average risk and a high return is okay in my book. It's that is definitely something that I will look forward to if I was invested into a fund or a stock, even for that matter. If I can maximize on my investment, with very little risk, that's what we're looking for. Also, the dividends here. The dividends were constantly growing here. Just throwing some numbers out. Let's see, in 2011, 0.337, 2012, 0.383. It dropped between the years of 2014 to 2016, kind of between the 0.15, 0.16. So it did suffer a big drop during that particular time. But in year 2017, those came back up, in year 17, the last reported dividend was 0.305, and the total returns for that particular year was 25.82 returns. So that looks, quite promising. And last but least, was the select automotive portfolio or mutual fund that I had taken a look at. And here, the average annual returns were constantly growing. They did suffer a drop estimated drop, of course, between year 1 and year 3. It was at 15.86. Year 3 dropped to 3.51. Um, and from year 5 it was 7.51, so it's up, 4%, and then from there it moved to 10.63. Something that I didn't think was so great were the expense ratios of 0.097, and the turnover was extremely high at 117%. The fund manager hasn't been there that long, roughly about a year, since April of 2017. So that can play a part as well as some things. Also, this particular firm was rated by Morningstar as having a high risk in a high risk fund category, but they're having below average returns. So again, based on the risk and return model, if you take a high risk, you essentially expect to get a high return on that risk that you put in, that investment that you put in. So with that not balancing out, I definitely would not want to invest into this mutual fund. Also, the dividends were very sticky. They were not consistent. Um, it's, from 0.07 moves to a 0.261. Then we go to a 0.45, then to a 0.196, and then over to a 0.06. So they kind of were just fluctuating here and there, based on what was going on in the market, and their total returns for each of the years was not great at all. That completes my consumer discretionary section. So overall, after analyzing most of the mutual funds, I know that my strategies, um, of course, will be altered based on particular firms. Some would have more weight than the others, just like time management. The time that management was with the firm weighed in on, my decision, and sometimes it had, a small weight on the decision, being that, the other numbers as far as the annual returns and the dividends, as far as the risk looked promising. So I kind of factored in, for the most part, those were the main factors. But again, for each mutual fund, it held a different weight for each one based on um, everything, um, all the different items being put together, So as a whole, those were the ones that I decided to go with out of the domestic, international, and a sector fund.